What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to College Football Talk with Peter Burnett. In today's episode, I'm going to be going over my predictions for the conference championships, who I think reaches the 12-team playoffs, some of the teams that I think might be just on the outside looking in, and of course, ultimately, who I think will be the national champions of college football. It's time to get into preview season. You know the drill. If you go on to enjoy this video, please feel free to leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and turn on those post notifications so you're always up to date whenever I upload. But without further ado, let's dive straight into it. And first things first, starting out with the ACC. Out of this conference, I think it does come down to two teams. It's going to come down to Clemson and Florida State. Both of these teams meet in the regular season October 5th. I could see, as the Seminoles start to reacclimate some new players, adjust from the losses from last year, the Tigers potentially pulling an upset and winning this one. However, I think these two teams meet again in the ACC championship game. I think Florida State maybe has another loss elsewhere. I think they're sitting at 10-2. I think Clemson is 11-1, and I think the second time around, Florida State gets the win. Then Clemson is going to be in very strong CFP consideration, finishing 11-2. So out of the ACC, I have Clemson finishing 11-2, the runner-up in the conference to Florida State, who I also have as 11-2, getting the auto bid. And then some other teams to watch in this conference. I've got Virginia Tech. I think if they finish with their only two losses this season coming to Miami and Clemson, they don't have a very tough slate outside of those games. But if those are their only two losses, they're certainly going to have a case for the playoff. I have Miami going 9-3. I know they have a lot of high expectations. In my way too early playoff predictions, I had them getting to the college football playoff, but after evaluating Virginia Tech, I think the Hokies have enough to beat the Hurricanes this year. And then one other team that's a little bit of a dark horse. It depends on how Kyle McCord plugs in and how much he can control that offense. I think the Syracuse Orange could be a team to watch in the ACC. Then in the Big 12, I think it's a very deep conference, but I think only a couple of teams really have a chance at the playoff. Utah at 10-2, Arizona 9-3, Kansas 9-3, and Oklahoma State probably right about there at either 9-3 or 8-4. I know a lot of people are high on the Cowboys. I think outside of Ollie Gordon, I think they leave a little bit to be desired. And I have Utah winning the conference, another team at 11-2, also winning a rematch against Arizona, who I could see winning the regular season matchup. So again, here a little bit of a case of revenge as the Utes get the automatic bid out of the Big 12. Then the Big Ten. Of course, these next two conferences I'm going over are two of the deepest in college football. I very well could see this being a three-way tie at the top. I think Ohio State finishes with one loss that likely comes October 12th in Eugene against Oregon, who I also have 11-1. Honestly, Oregon, I think, has the best shot to run this slate undefeated. I have them actually being upset at Wisconsin. I could easily see it being either the game against the Buckeyes or potentially against the Wolverines in Ann Arbor, but I think the Ducks also finish 11-1. And then Penn State, they avoid Oregon, and I think their one loss comes against Ohio State. They also avoid Michigan. And speaking of those Wolverines, my projection for them is finishing 9-3. 10-2 wouldn't shock me. 8-4 would surprise me a little bit. So I think either 9-3 or 10-2. I think that leaves them outside of the race, obviously, for the Big Ten, but I think very much in playoff contention. I'll get to that in a bit. Two other teams then, USC, I could see going 9-3, maybe with losses to LSU, Michigan, and one other team on their schedule. And then Nebraska. The Cornhuskers are a team that everybody might be talking about in mid to late October. They have a very likely chance to start the season 7-0 before they face Ohio State, which I'd expect to be a loss. But even after that, you lose to a top 3 team, top 2 team in the country, one that many project to be the national champions. If that's your one loss, I think the Cornhuskers will definitely be in playoff contention, and they could find themselves in that top 10 in the first CFP rankings this year. And that's kind of it in the Big Ten. I think Oregon maybe does the double over Ohio State. They win in the Big Ten championship game. I could easily, out of all the teams I've outlined so far, I could see the Ducks being the most likely to finish undefeated. I just think they have a loss in there somewhere. I threw it in for Wisconsin. Honestly, there's not too much to that. I project game by game. I think going into Camp Randall late in the season, likely going to be pretty cold. Not like it doesn't get cold in Eugene. Potentially, weather game there. That could be a game to keep an eye on, especially with, I think, Luke Fickell will have the Badgers going in the right direction this year. And then the SEC. This is undoubtedly the deepest in college football. The Big Ten is very talented at the top. I don't think it has much weight outside of the teams that I talked about. In the SEC, you've got Georgia. I could see him running the table. I could also see him dropping one of those games against Ole Miss, Alabama, or Texas. I have them 11-1. Ole Miss, I also have 11-1. They avoid Texas on their schedule. And speaking of those Longhorns, I have them at 10-2. That's because I've got them having a sneaky upset at the hands of Texas A&M to end the season. I think Mike Elko could really start his Texas A&M tenure on the right note with an upset to end the regular season. And the Longhorns in that game, it's almost, I think, like in the NFL, when a team knows they've locked up kind of a wild card bid, they probably don't have a chance of the division, or in this case the conference. Maybe they rest their starters even, and maybe even if they don't, I could see first time these two teams have played in a while, the Aggies pulling the shock upset. Then a bunch of the teams that I could see finishing 9-3. Leading the way is Alabama. I think out of these teams, they have the toughest schedule. They'll have the best resume out of this group. LSU as well at 9-3. Tennessee at 9-3. Mizzou at 9-3. And Oklahoma then either 8-4 or 9-3. Those are all the teams in the SEC and my projections for them by record. I think Georgia, maybe if they lose the regular season game against Ole Miss, I think they get the job done in the SEC championship game. And I think it'll be tight between them and Oregon, but I think Georgia gets the number 1 overall seed. And so that would mean Oregon gets number 2. I think Florida State just ahead of Utah. So my top 4 seeds in this order are Georgia, the SEC champs, Oregon, the Big Ten champs, Florida State, the ACC champs, and Utah, the Big 12 champs. I'll save the at-larges for just after this section, but now I'm going to go over the teams in the Group of 5 or the independents. I haven't gone over them in depth. I might save them for an individual video. I think Notre Dame goes 10-2. I think they could be a USC loss that knocks the Trojans out of the playoff race potentially late in the season. They have a tough schedule as well, Notre Dame does. Or I guess not a tough schedule overall, but they have some tough games on the schedule, including Florida State. And then out of the Group of 5, I think there's a couple of really good contenders. There's Memphis in the American Conference. Their big game also is at Florida State. I think that'll be tough for the Tigers. I really don't see them winning that game. Then you've got UTSA. I project them to have 1 loss, maybe 2. And then the big one to me is between Liberty and App State. Those two teams will meet in Lynchburg, Virginia on September 28th. I think the winner of that game positions themselves really well to be in the race. However, the team that I think will get that conference champion Group of 5 bid will be Boise State out of the Mountain West. I think they have a solid team. If you want me to dive into the Broncos, comment below. I might take a look at them anyways, but I wanted to get these projections out before the regular season starts, or at least before week 0 starts. So that's who I think emerges. I think their lone loss is against Oregon, and if it's to the number 2 team, I think Memphis would have a case if they have 1 loss, but these other teams on here wouldn't have a quality loss like that. So I think if they can run the table in the Mountain West, they can afford to lose that game against Oregon and likely get in, even over, I think, an undefeated Liberty. But if Liberty has that win over a 1 or 2 loss App State, I think that is also a huge resume booster as well. So obviously that means Boise State would be the 12. I guess if they have 1 loss, I can maybe see them getting like the 11 seed, but more likely out of the Group of 5, they're going to be a little bit lower. I think they're also, I'll have to double check this, they're outside the top 25, but I think they're the one receiving the most votes out of the Group of 5, so they're already kind of in that pole position. If they can just handle business, they should be the team that gets in. Now outlining some of these other seeds. I think the 2 easy ones, it's just a matter of what the order is. Ohio State and Ole Miss. I think both of those teams, being the conference runners-up, have a really good case. And Penn State would have an argument to be ahead of Ohio State because they only have 1 loss. But I think the argument that Ohio State has 2 losses, in my projections, both being to Oregon And the fact that they win the head-to-head will certainly keep the Buckeyes ahead. And I think Ole Miss also would deserve to be ahead of Penn State because of their strength of schedule. I have it Ohio State 5 and Ole Miss 6. I could easily see it being reversed. I don't think that's too important. I have Penn State then at 7. I think those are probably the easy ones. And then Texas at number 8 with that 10-2 record. I think if they only have one loss and they're not in the SEC championship game, I think they probably get up to that number 6 spot ahead of Ole Miss. Coming in at number 9 is a 10-2 Notre Dame with their losses coming against Florida State, Texas A&M, or potentially USC. So the Fighting Irish, I think, with 2 losses, though, are pretty much a lock, and I think that 9 spot is the right spot for them. Then another 2-loss conference runner-up team. I think Clemson is able to get in. They get the 10 spot. They go up against Penn State. And then that final spot, you're going to have a lot of teams clamoring for this one. You're going to have a Virginia Tech team that's only 2 losses are to Clemson, who's just ahead of them, and to Miami, who I think is 9-3 and just outside looking in. You're also going to then have USC, who's going to be there with, I think, 3 losses. Even Nebraska with 3 losses. You're going to have LSU, Tennessee, Missouri. A lot of those teams, I think ultimately, though, it comes down to one of 2 teams. I think it's either Michigan or Alabama, and boy, is that a tough decision to make. Michigan's losses, in my projection, would come to Texas, Oregon, and Ohio State. 3 playoff teams, 3 top 8 teams, so those are some really good losses. Alabama's losses would come to Georgia, Tennessee, and Oklahoma or LSU. I guess if they lost the game to LSU, that would give the Tigers, pole position, the head-to-head over the Crimson Tide. I think Michigan's losses would outweigh their wins, maybe not so much. I think Alabama's wins would be a little bit more impressive, but I think Michigan, the fact that they play that tough schedule. Ultimately, though, I think they do go with the Wolverines just because of their quality losses to quality opponents to 3 other playoff teams, and so that puts Michigan at number 11. So the first round matchups, and these are home games for the higher seeds, would be Boise State at Ohio State. That's the 12 versus 5. Notre Dame at Texas. Those teams have had a couple of good non-conference games in the last few years, or I guess last decade now. Infamously, of course, the Texas is back game. Michigan at Ole Miss, 11 versus 6. I think that's a good matchup as well. And Clemson at Penn State, the 10 versus 7 matchup. I think Ohio State wins pretty comfortably. They go on to play Utah. I think Texas also wins pretty comfortably. I think they might. They're going to have to adjust. They're going to have to fix their passing issues this year, pass defense issues. And if they're able to figure those out, I think it might take some time to figure out some of those issues, but I don't think they'll be challenged in that area by Notre Dame. So I think Texas moves on to face Georgia. Michigan at Ole Miss, I think, is a good game, but I think the Rebels are just a little bit too, high-powered on offense, and I think the adjustments that they've made have improved their defense dramatically. So they go on to face Florida State. And then Clemson at Penn State. I think the Tigers put up a fight, but I think it's a straight sweep. 4 out of 4 home teams win. I think that'll just provide such a distinct advantage, especially for the Nittany Lions as well, likely playing a game in what would be a very cold Happy Valley and have the advantage there. So then the next matchups, obviously these ones are a little bit closer. I think Ohio State has a little bit too much for Utah to handle, and I think their defense is maybe on par with the Utes, who kind of pride themselves on their defense. The Utes will be interesting with Cam Rising back at quarterback, but I think Ohio State gets the win there. Then Texas against Georgia. This will be a clash of the Titans. I think this game is worthy of being college football playoff semifinal. In this matchup, though, I think Georgia, their offense is really good. I know people are starting to give Carson Beck the credit that he deserves, but I think he really is potentially the, maybe not front runner, but one of the top front runners for winning the Heisman this year. And obviously the Bulldogs defense has been very good for the better part of a decade now. So I think the Bulldogs move on to face the Buckeyes in the first semifinal. I think Ole Miss just has too much for Florida State. I think their defensive additions are big. I think their high-powered offense is able to take care of the Seminoles, so they move on. And then Penn State against Oregon. This would be the Big Ten matchup that does not happen in the regular season. I think it'd be a really good matchup. Drew Aller, has a little bit of detriments against him because he doesn't throw for a ton of yards, but he manages the game really well. He only threw I think 2 or 3 picks last year. So if he can keep that up, I think he keeps the Nittany Lions in this game. But I think Oregon is just a little too overpowered. So the other semifinal then, Ole Miss against Oregon. I think really these are 4 of the best 5 teams. Honestly, like I said, I think Texas is probably better than Ole Miss. If those 2 teams met in the regular season, I think that would change how things look in my projections. But because they don't, I have Texas getting knocked out, a round earlier because they come up against Georgia. Ohio State against Georgia, I think this game is probably worthy of being the championship game. I think, out of every 10 people, you probably have 5 picking maybe the Buckeyes right now. They seem to be picked a little bit more, 4 picking Georgia, and then the odd one out picking like in Oregon or a Texas or something like that. These 2 teams are, I think, the 2 best teams in college football. I think because of how the schedule lines up, though, and their matchups, I think Oregon is able to beat Ohio State, and I think Georgia is able to do the same. So I have Georgia going to the national championship game over the Buckeyes. And then Ole Miss against Oregon, I think, is a really good matchup. Both of these teams have made some good defensive additions to go with their already electric offenses. Obviously, Dylan Gabriel coming in for Bo Nix to lead the Oregon offense, I think will add an extra dynamic to their offense. And I think the Ducks go on to the national championship game. This one is tough. I really could see, I think these are 2 of the top 3 teams. If I were to list my top 3 teams in no particular order, I would say Oregon, Ohio State, and Georgia. So these 2 teams meeting for the national championship, I think, is just about the best championship game that we can get. I think the Ducks put up a fight, but I think the Bulldogs are able to, it's one of those games where maybe they force a turnover late, and maybe it increases their advantage, maybe a pick 6 or something like that. But I think the Georgia Bulldogs get back on top of the college football mountain this year. I think Kirby Smart wins his 3rd national championship and starts what is the new dynasty in college football, replacing the one at Alabama with Nick Saban. But let me know your thoughts in the comments below, who you think wins out of each of the conferences, who you think makes and just misses out on the playoff, who ultimately wins everything. Kind of one last thing before I give my outro. Obviously, like the first team out, as I talked about, kind of the debate between the 2 teams would be Alabama. I think after Alabama, it's really kind of, there's a lot of teams. This is not really any particular order. Virginia Tech would be right there. Miami would be right there. USC, maybe Nebraska, probably a Kansas or Oklahoma State out of the Big 12, and then all those teams in the SEC, LSU, Tennessee, Missouri, and even maybe Oklahoma. So, again, those are my projections. Let me know in the comments what you think about them. I'm really looking forward to college football season ramping up here soon. But thank you so much for taking the time to watch College Football Talk with Peter Burtnett. I'm your host, Peter, signing out. Peace.